Bodycam was still rolling. One wrong press captured the cop, framing an innocent man. The sun was beginning to set, casting an orange glow across the quiet suburban streets. James Walker had just wrapped up another long day at the small hardware store where he worked. His hands were tired, his muscles aching from hours of stocking shelves and assisting customers. The day had been typical, nothing too extraordinary to speak of. He had greeted the regulars, helped Mrs. Miller pick out new garden tools, and exchanged pleasantries with Mr. Jacobs, who was always complaining about the price of paint. After locking up the store and walking out to his car, James slipped behind the wheel, the soft hum of the engine filling the air as he drove home. It was a short drive, just a few miles, but he relished the peace and quiet of the evening. He loved coming home to the small, cozy house he'd bought a few years ago. The lawn was well kept, the windows clean, and there was always something satisfying about the sight of his own front door. James had worked hard for everything he had, and it felt good to know that he had a life that was his own, free from complications. As he pulled into the driveway, he noticed the lights in the house were dimmed, a sign that his wife, Sarah, had already started preparing dinner. She was always the first to get home, but she never minded waiting for him. She loved cooking, and James loved the meals she made. Tonight, he imagined, there would be something simple, maybe pasta or chicken with plenty of vegetables on the side. He was looking forward to it. But little did he know, his life was about to be turned upside down in a way that would alter everything he believed about his safety and the justice system he had always trusted. Inside the house, Sarah was humming to herself, chopping vegetables for dinner. She glanced at the clock and sighed. James was usually home by now. She didn't mind, though. She had learned to be patient, knowing that sometimes work ran late. Her thoughts were interrupted when the doorbell rang. Who could that be at this hour? She wondered, wiping her hands on her apron before walking toward the front door. When she opened it, she was greeted by a police officer standing in the doorway. He looked official, his uniform pressed and his expression stern. "Good evening, ma'am," he said politely. "I need to speak with James Walker." Sarah blinked, confused. "My husband?" she asked. "Is there a problem?" The officer shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting toward the ground for a brief moment. "I'm afraid there's been an incident and your husband is needed for questioning. Can I come in?" Sarah's heart skipped a beat. Something wasn't right. She stepped aside, letting the officer enter. As soon as he crossed the threshold, the tension in the air seemed to double. She didn't know why, but the officer's presence was unsettling. "Please, just wait here for a moment," Sarah said, trying to keep her voice steady. She rushed to the living room to grab her phone. Her mind raced with thoughts of what could have possibly happened. Had James gotten into trouble? No, he was a good man, a kind man. He'd never do anything wrong. Her fingers trembled as she dialed his number, but it went straight to voicemail. "James, where are you? The officer's here." "He wants to talk to you," she said urgently, trying to hide the panic in her voice. She hung up and glanced back toward the officer, who was waiting in the hallway, his hands clasped behind his back. Before she could ask him anything else, the sound of tires screeching outside interrupted her. She looked out the window and saw James's car pull into the driveway. He was home. Relief washed over her as she opened the door for him. But the moment his eyes met the officer's, something in the air shifted. His face drained of color and he froze for a second. The officer approached him slowly, his voice calm but firm. "Mr. Walker, I need you to come with me." "You're under arrest for suspicion of assault and robbery." James blinked, confused. What are you talking about? I haven't done anything wrong." The officer didn't respond immediately. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a pair of handcuffs, moving toward James without a word. Sarah, standing in the doorway, watched in disbelief. She could barely comprehend what was happening. James, the man she had been married to for nearly 5 years, was being arrested. "Is this a mistake?" she asked desperately, looking between her husband and the officer. "James doesn't do anything wrong. You must have the wrong person." The officer didn't acknowledge her, but his gaze remained cold and unflinching. "Ma'am, I'm afraid there's no mistake. We have evidence." With a sense of shock and disbelief, Sarah watched as the officer led James away from their home, his hands cuffed behind his back. The cold night air bit at her skin as she stood there, frozen. She wanted to scream, to do something, but her body wouldn't move. James didn't understand. He was being treated like a criminal, but he had never been anything but a law-abiding citizen. He hadn't been in trouble with the law before, and he sure hadn't been involved in any robbery or assault. The police officer's words rang in his ears as he was loaded into the back of a patrol car. His heart pounded in his chest, and his mind raced as he tried to make sense of it all. The ride to the police station felt like an eternity. James sat in the backseat of the patrol car, his mind spinning. He tried to think of anything he could have done to deserve this, but nothing came to mind. Had there been some sort of mix-up? Surely, there had to be an explanation. Maybe it was a case of mistaken identity. Perhaps there was another man named James Walker involved in something terrible. Whatever the case, James clung to the hope that everything would be cleared up once they got to the station. When they arrived, he was immediately taken inside, his hands still cuffed as they led him into an interrogation room. The cold walls seemed to close in on him as he sat down at the table. A detective entered shortly after, sitting across from him with a file in hand. "Mr. Walker," the detective said, looking at him with suspicion. "We have a pretty solid case against you. You've been caught on camera at the scene of a robbery and witnesses have identified you." James shook his head in disbelief. "That's impossible. I wasn't even there." "I don't know what you're talking about." The detective didn't respond right away. Instead, he glanced at the file, flipping through the pages. James noticed that there were photos of him at the scene, but they didn't make any sense. He had never been there. The detective finally spoke, his voice cold. "Well, we've got enough to hold you for now. You'll have to wait until we can sort this out. But if I were you, I'd start thinking about what you're going to tell the judge." As the detective left the room, James was left alone, still in disbelief at the turn of events. Little did he know, the truth was already being captured on another piece of technology. A bodycam, still rolling, unnoticed by the officer who had orchestrated the entire thing. The hours seemed to stretch into infinity as James sat in the small, dimly lit interrogation room. He had no idea how long it had been since the detective had left. Time blurred together, his thoughts racing in circles. Every few minutes the door would creak open, and another officer would pass by, but no one came to speak with him. He was left alone with his thoughts, a growing sense of dread slowly taking hold. He kept replaying the same scene in his mind, the moment he had been arrested. It was so surreal, as if he had stepped into a nightmare. The police officer, the one who had arrested him, seemed so sure, so certain of James's guilt. But James knew he hadn't done anything wrong. It made no sense. He wasn't involved in any robbery, and he hadn't been anywhere near the scene. But the more he thought about it, the more confused he became. What if someone was trying to frame him? What if he had been in the wrong place at the wrong time? He needed answers, but they didn't come. Every time the door opened, he expected someone to give him an explanation, to tell him it had all been a mistake. But it never happened. Instead, the officers just passed by, ignoring him completely, as if he were a ghost. Every few moments, he would glance at the small window in the door, half expecting to see someone watching him. But the room was empty, and the silence grew heavier. Eventually, the door creaked open again, and this time it wasn't a passing officer. It was Detective Harris, the man who had first questioned him. He walked into the room with a confident stride, his shoes clicking sharply on the tile floor. He set a folder down in front of James, its contents hidden from view. "Mr. Walker, we've been going over the evidence," Detective Harris said, his voice calm and measured. "You're in a difficult situation. We've got footage that places you at the scene of the crime. Witnesses have identified you. It's looking pretty bad for you." James's heart sank. He opened his mouth to speak, but found no words. "Footage? What footage? I wasn't there. I didn't do anything," he finally managed to say, his voice cracking. Detective Harris didn't respond immediately. Instead, he flipped open the folder and pulled out several photos. He slid them across the table to James. The images were grainy, but there was no mistaking it. They showed a man in the same clothes James had been wearing earlier that day. The man was standing at the front of a convenience store, and in his hand was a bag full of what looked like cash. The image was shaky, as though it had been taken quickly and without permission. James stared at the photo, his mind racing. The man in the picture looked similar to him, but it wasn't him. It couldn't be. He had never been to that store, and he had never seen that bag of cash in his life. But the more he looked at the photo, the more doubts crept into his mind. What if it was him? What if he was just forgetting? But no, he hadn't done anything wrong. "Detective," James said, his voice trembling, "I swear I wasn't there. I don't know who that is in the picture, but it's not me." Detective Harris looked at him, studying his face carefully. Your clothes match, Mr. Walker, and you were seen on the surveillance camera in the area. The witnesses swear they saw you. James's stomach turned. But I haven't been near that place. I don't even know where it is, he protested. Harris leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. We've checked your alibi, Mr. Walker. Your whereabouts for the last few hours don't match up with your story. It's not looking good. The words hit James like a punch to the gut. He had no idea what was happening. He hadn't done anything wrong, but here he was, trapped in a nightmare. The detective's words echoed in his mind as he tried to make sense of it all. How could this be happening? What did he do to deserve this? Listen to me, James said, his voice rising with desperation. I'm telling you I didn't do it. You have to believe me. There's been a mistake. I swear I don't even know where that store is. You can check my phone records, my GPS history. I wasn't there. Detective Harris didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stood up and walked over to a small table in the corner of the room. He picked up a bodycam and turned it over in his hands. We've got something else here, Harris said, his tone colder now. Something that might change things for you. James's heart skipped a beat. What do you mean? What is that? It's the bodycam footage from Officer Daniels. He was with you when you were arrested, Harris said, holding the camera up. We've reviewed it. It's crucial evidence, but you're going to have to explain yourself when it comes to this. James felt a wave of panic wash over him. The bodycam footage. He hadn't thought about it until now. He had seen it on the officer when he was arrested, but it didn't cross his mind that it could be used against him. He had no idea what the footage contained. But now, as the detective placed the camera on the table in front of him, he began to feel a gnawing sense of dread. Why don't you tell me what's going on here? Harris said, his voice now taking on a tone of challenge. Why did Officer Daniels press the button on his bodycam just before your arrest? We're about to find out what really happened. James's throat tightened. He tried to swallow, but his mouth was dry. I don't know, he said, his voice shaky. I don't know what you're talking about. I didn't do anything. The detective stared at him for a long moment, then slowly reached for the bodycam and pressed a button. The small screen on the camera flickered to life. James watched, horrified, as the scene unfolded before him. It showed Officer Daniels approaching him during the arrest. James had no memory of the moment, but he could see everything on the screen. The footage was grainy and shaky, but it was clear enough to make out the officer's movements. The officer was speaking to him, but James couldn't hear the words over the static. Then, the camera cut to a moment where the officer seemed to press something, and for a split second, the view shifted, showing him walking away and appearing to plant something on James. The screen flickered again and the footage cut out. James blinked in disbelief. His breath caught in his throat as he tried to process what he had just seen. The officer had planted something. He had framed him. The bodycam had captured it all. As the footage ended, silence filled the room. James's mind was spinning and his heart raced in his chest. The truth was right there in front of him. Officer Daniels had framed him for a crime he didn't commit. But why? Why would he do such a thing? Detective Harris looked at him with a raised eyebrow, his expression one of curiosity, almost like he was waiting for James to break down. But James didn't. He couldn't. He was too shocked to speak, too stunned by what he had just witnessed. Now, Mr. Walker, Harris said after a long pause, I think we're getting somewhere. James couldn't believe what he had just seen on the bodycam footage. The image was still fresh in his mind, the officer's actions clearly caught on tape. The fact that someone could deliberately set him up for something he hadn't done was unimaginable. He had always trusted the police, always believed in the justice system. But now, everything he thought he knew about fairness and honesty was being shattered right before his eyes. How had it come to this? After Detective Harris finished playing the footage, he sat back in his chair, his eyes fixed on James, waiting for a response. James didn't know what to say. His thoughts were tangled in a knot of confusion and disbelief. The image of Officer Daniels planting evidence on him was so clear, but James couldn't understand why it was happening. Was the officer acting alone? Was there a larger conspiracy at play? He didn't have the answers. All he knew was that his life had just turned upside down in the span of a few hours. The room felt smaller now, the air heavier. He could barely breathe as his mind raced. He wanted to scream, to shout, to demand that everyone see what had happened. But he couldn't find the words. He was trapped in a nightmare with no way out. His heart pounded in his chest, and his palms were clammy with sweat. He had to figure out what to do next, but everything seemed so unclear. His future felt uncertain, and the weight of the situation was beginning to sink in. Detective Harris remained silent, allowing the tension in the room to build. James glanced up at him, his voice barely above a whisper. Why would he do that? Why would he frame me?" The detective leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table. "That's the question we're all asking, Mr. Walker. Why would Officer Daniels plant evidence on you? And more importantly, who else is involved?" James shook his head, his mind racing. "I don't know. I've never met him before. I've never done anything to him." Harris nodded slowly. "It doesn't add up. It's too strange. But we'll find out one way or another." James tried to steady his breathing. The weight of the detective's words hung in the air. There were so many questions, so many things he didn't understand. Who was behind this? Why had the officer done this to him? What was he trying to achieve? The more James thought about it, the more he realized how little he knew about what was happening. He had no answers, only the chilling realization that his life had been stolen from him by a man he didn't even know. Another silence filled the room, stretching out like an endless gap between them. James felt the heat rising in his chest, a surge of frustration building up inside him. He wanted to lash out, to demand that someone fix this, to get answers. But instead, all he could do was sit there, helpless, waiting for someone else to take action. Finally, Detective Harris broke the silence. "We're going to need to figure out where Officer Daniels was during the time of the robbery. We need to find out if anyone else knew what he was doing, if anyone else was involved. This won't be easy, but we have to follow the leads." James nodded, though the words barely sank in. He was still processing everything, still struggling to make sense of the situation. But he realized that this wasn't just about him anymore. It was about finding out the truth, about uncovering the real story behind this entire mess. "If you want my help, I'll do whatever I can," James said quietly, his voice steadying. "I need to know why this happened. I need to know what went wrong." Harris seemed to appreciate his resolve. He gave a small nod. "Good. We'll need your full cooperation moving forward, but I think we're getting closer. The footage is a big breakthrough. Now we just have to figure out what comes next." James leaned back in his chair, his mind still racing. He couldn't stop thinking about the bodycam footage, about the moment when Officer Daniels had pressed the button on his camera. There had been something so deliberate in his actions, as if he had planned the entire thing. The more James thought about it, the more questions bubbled up. Had the officer been working alone? Was there someone else who knew about the framing? Was there a deeper conspiracy at play? For the next few days, things moved quickly. The detective team worked tirelessly to follow every lead, every scrap of information they could find. They tracked down the convenience store's security footage, spoke with the witnesses who had identified James, and dug deeper into Officer Daniels' background. The more they uncovered, the more they realized that there was something far more sinister going on than they had originally thought. James spent his time at home, pacing back and forth in his living room, unable to focus on anything else. Every time the phone rang, his heart would race, his stomach turning with anticipation. Was it the detective with new information? Had they found something that could prove his innocence? Or was it bad news? Finally, a week after the bodycam footage had been discovered, Detective Harris called him with an update. "Mr. Walker, we've uncovered something important," the detective said on the phone, his voice tense. "We've traced Officer Daniels' movements leading up to the robbery. It looks like he was part of a much larger scheme. He wasn't working alone." James felt a chill run down his spine. "What do you mean? Who else was involved?" "We're still piecing it together," Harris said. "But we've discovered that Daniels had been in contact with someone outside of the department. Someone who had a vested interest in framing you for this crime. We think there may be a larger criminal network at play here, and Daniels was part of it." The news hit James like a ton of bricks. He had known something didn't add up, but hearing the truth out loud made it all too real. He was just one small piece of a much bigger puzzle, and the pieces were starting to fall into place. "Do you think I'm the only one they've framed?" James asked, his voice tight with emotion. "We're not sure," Harris replied. "But it's becoming clear that this wasn't just about you. You were an easy target, and they used you to cover up their tracks." James sat down, his legs suddenly feeling weak. The detective's words echoed in his mind. He had been an innocent man caught in a web of lies and deceit. But now the truth was coming to light, and with it, a chance to prove his innocence. As the days passed, the investigation continued to unfold. More evidence came to light, and the case against Officer Daniels began to unravel. He was arrested and charged with conspiracy, tampering with evidence, and a number of other crimes. It turned out that he had been working with a criminal organization, using his position in the police force to manipulate cases and frame innocent people. For James, the news was a bittersweet victory. The truth had come out, but the damage had already been done. His life had been turned upside down, and the scars of this experience would remain with him forever. But at least now, he could finally move forward, knowing that the people who had framed him were being held accountable. In the end, justice had been served. But James knew that the real work was just beginning, rebuilding his life, his reputation, and his trust in a system that had failed him. It would take time, but with the support of his family and friends, he was determined to heal. The days following the arrest of Officer Daniels were a blur for James. As much as he wanted to feel relief, he couldn't shake the lingering unease that had settled in his chest. The truth was out now. Officer Daniels had framed him, but the damage was done. The arrest, the public scrutiny, the hours of confusion and uncertainty, they had all taken a toll on James. His reputation had been tarnished, and his life had been disrupted in ways he couldn't yet fully understand. As Detective Harris had promised, they continued to investigate the criminal network behind Officer Daniels. The pieces were falling into place, but there were still so many unanswered questions. How deep did the corruption go? Who else was involved? And perhaps most importantly, how did this all connect back to James? He wasn't just a victim in a random case. There had been a reason he was chosen. He just didn't know what it was. Over the next few weeks, things slowly began to shift. The investigation revealed more details about the web of deceit that Daniels had been entangled in. It turned out that the officer had been working for a group of corrupt individuals, using his position in the police force to manipulate cases and frame innocent people. James wasn't the first, but he had been the most recent. It was hard for James to process everything. He tried to go back to his daily routine, but it wasn't the same. How could it be? The small-town life he had built for himself, the one that had once seemed so secure and predictable, now felt alien. He couldn't help but feel a sense of betrayal, not just by the officer, but by the system that had allowed it to happen in the first place. Still, he tried to hold on to hope. His lawyer had been working tirelessly to clear his name, and slowly, the pieces of his defense were coming together. The bodycam footage had been the key. It had proved that Officer Daniels had planted evidence on him, a fact that couldn't be disputed. The rest of the evidence was circumstantial, but it was enough to make the case against Daniels clear. As time passed, more and more people began to rally behind James. News of his wrongful arrest had spread through the community, and many of his neighbors and friends couldn't believe that something like this could happen to him. They had known him for years. He was a hard worker, a good man, someone who always did his best to help others. The idea that he could be involved in a crime, let alone framed for one, was unthinkable. But even with the support of those around him, James couldn't escape the feeling that he had lost something important. The trust he had once placed in the police and the justice system had been shattered. Every time he saw a police officer on the street, a chill ran down his spine. He knew not every officer was like Daniels, but the fear that the system could fail him again lingered in his mind. One evening a few weeks after Daniels' arrest, James sat in his living room staring at the TV, though he wasn't really watching. His mind was elsewhere, lost in thought. The phone rang, breaking the silence. He picked it up quickly, relieved to hear the voice of his lawyer, Michael. "James," Michael said, his tone serious, "we've got some good news. The judge has ruled in your favor. The charges have been dropped." James sat up, his heart racing. "What does that mean?" "It means that you're no longer facing criminal charges," Michael explained. "We've proven that you were framed and the court has dismissed the case. This is it. It's over." A wave of emotion washed over James. For weeks he had been trapped in a nightmare, unsure of how it would end. Now, finally, there was light at the end of the tunnel. He wasn't a criminal. He hadn't done anything wrong. The truth had come out and he was free. But even as he absorbed the news, James couldn't ignore the lingering emptiness inside. It was over, yes. But what did that mean for him? Could he ever go back to the life he had before? Could he trust the system again? "I don't know what to say," James murmured, his voice trembling with emotion. Thank you, Michael. Thank you so much. Don't thank me just yet, Michael said with a chuckle. We've still got work to do. You're going to need to rebuild your reputation, but the first step is done. You're cleared. Now we'll work on making sure the world knows the truth. James nodded, though he wasn't sure how to process everything. The past few weeks had been a whirlwind, and now that it was finally over, he felt a mix of relief and uncertainty. He had his life back, but it would never be the same. The scars of the experience would remain with him forever. The next few days were a blur as James tried to piece together the fragments of his life. The news outlets had picked up on the story, and reporters were calling, eager to interview him. But James wasn't ready for that. He wasn't interested in making a spectacle out of his ordeal. He just wanted to move on, to heal, and to find a way to put the whole thing behind him. The support from his friends and family continued, and he leaned on them as much as he could. They helped him through the rough moments, reminding him that he was more than the events that had happened. He was still James, the same man who had worked hard, cared for his family, and done his best to be a good person. He couldn't let this experience define him. But no matter how much he tried to push the past behind him, he couldn't escape the questions. He kept wondering why he had been chosen, why Officer Daniels had targeted him. It had all seemed so random, so senseless. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that he might never get all the answers. Some things he would just have to accept. A few weeks after the charges were dropped, Detective Harris reached out to James again. He asked if they could meet. James agreed, curious to hear more about the investigation. When they sat down together, Harris wasted no time. "We've learned more about the group Daniels was working with," Harris said. "It turns out there's a network of corrupt officers in different departments, all working together. Daniels was just one piece of the puzzle. We're still trying to unravel it all, but we've got a few leads." James felt a wave of anger rise in his chest. He had been caught in the middle of something much bigger than he had ever realized. The corruption was deep, and it wasn't just one bad officer. It was a whole system that had failed him and countless others before him. "I want to help," James said, his voice firm. "If you need anything, I'll do what I can." Harris looked at him with a mix of respect and gratitude. "I appreciate that, James. But right now, the best thing you can do is focus on yourself. You've been through a lot." James nodded, understanding the gravity of what he was being told. He was free, but the journey wasn't over. There were still people out there who had tried to destroy his life, and he wanted to make sure they couldn't do it to anyone else. The weeks that followed were a time of rebuilding for James. He spent more time with his family, working on his relationships, and trying to regain the sense of normalcy he had lost. The scars would never fully heal, but with each passing day, he felt stronger, more at peace. In the end, James realized that he had been through something that many people never would. He had faced a darkness he couldn't have imagined, but he had emerged on the other side. The truth had come to light, and that was something no one could take away from him. As for Officer Daniels and the network of corrupt officers, they were eventually brought to justice. The investigation continued, and more arrests were made. But for James, the battle was over. He had won his freedom, and with that, he could finally begin to move forward with his life. Weeks turned into months, and life for James began to settle back into a more familiar routine. The shock and anxiety that had consumed him for so long gradually started to fade, though he knew the scars would remain. The ordeal had taken so much from him: trust, peace of mind, his sense of safety. But it had also taught him something important. He had learned just how fragile things could be, how quickly life could be turned upside down. And yet, he had survived it. The town had rallied behind him in ways he hadn't expected. People who once kept to themselves had reached out, offering their support. They brought over meals, wrote letters, and helped with small tasks around the house. His neighbors had even organized a small gathering in his honor when the news of his exoneration broke. James had never been one to seek the spotlight, but seeing how his community had come together for him was humbling. It reminded him that, even in the darkest moments, there was light to be found in the people around you. Still, there were days when James felt like he was carrying a heavy weight. He had been cleared of all charges, but the damage to his reputation had already been done. He wasn't sure if he would ever fully shake the feeling of being watched, the lingering sense of unease whenever he encountered someone in law enforcement. The truth was, no matter how many times he told himself it was over, he couldn't fully escape the emotional toll the experience had taken on him. Sarah, his wife, had been his rock throughout the whole process. She had stayed by his side every step of the way, comforting him when he was at his lowest, encouraging him when he wanted to give up. But even she knew how much the whole situation had changed him. James wasn't the same man he had been before the arrest. The spark in his eyes that once made him so full of life was now dimmed. The joy he once took in the small things, a quiet evening at home, a good meal, a walk in the park, was overshadowed by the weight of what he had gone through. Sarah could see it, and it broke her heart. "We'll get through this," she would say, her voice always steady, though James could hear the worry behind her words. "You're strong, we'll rebuild together." But it wasn't that simple. James knew Sarah meant well, but it wasn't just about rebuilding their life. It was about rebuilding his sense of trust in the world around him. How could he ever look at the police the same way? How could he ever trust that the justice system would protect him when he had seen just how easily it could fail? One evening, a few months after his exoneration, James sat alone in his living room, staring out the window. It was a quiet evening, the kind he used to enjoy before everything had changed. The sun was setting, casting a warm, golden glow across the neighborhood. Birds chirped outside, and the distant hum of traffic filled the air. For a moment, it felt as though everything was normal again, but then his thoughts drifted to the past, to the day he had been arrested, to the bodycam footage that had saved him. He remembered the cold feeling in his chest when he first saw the footage, the moment he realized the officer had planted evidence on him. The disbelief, the horror. He had never imagined something like that could happen to him. It felt like a distant memory now, but it was still fresh in his mind. The phone rang, pulling him from his thoughts. It was Detective Harris. "James," Harris said, his voice calm but with a hint of urgency. "We've got some new information about the network Daniels was working with. There's something you need to know." James's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't heard much from Harris since the investigation had wrapped up. "What is it?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "It's about the connections Daniels had with other officers. We've uncovered a few more names. We're closing in on some of the people who helped him frame you," Harris explained. "We think we're getting close to unraveling the entire network." James felt a knot form in his stomach. He had hoped that the truth was behind him, that he could finally move on. But hearing that the investigation was still ongoing made him realize that the ripple effects of Daniel's actions reached farther than he had imagined. "Do you think they'll go after me again?" James asked, his voice tight with worry. "Do you think they'll try to make me the target again?" "No," Harris replied quickly. "We've got you covered, James. You don't need to worry about that, but we can't let this go. We need to make sure that no one else ends up in your position." James closed his eyes, letting out a long breath. The weight of it all was starting to sink in again. The truth was out, but the fight wasn't over. The people who had tried to ruin his life were still out there, still operating in the shadows. He couldn't walk away from this. He needed to know the full story. He needed to make sure that what happened to him never happened to anyone else. "I want to help," James said, his voice firm. "Whatever you need me to do, I'm in." Harris was silent for a moment before responding. "I appreciate that, James, but right now you've done enough. We've got this from here. Just focus on taking care of yourself and your family." James nodded, even though he knew deep down that he couldn't just sit back and wait. He had been a victim, yes, but he was also a witness to something much larger. He couldn't ignore it. He had to stay involved for his own peace of mind and for the sake of anyone else who might find themselves in the same position he had been in. Over the next few months, Harris kept in touch with James. The investigation continued, slowly but surely. More officers were arrested, and more details about the criminal network were uncovered. The truth came out piece by piece, and with each revelation, James felt a small sense of justice. But the more he learned, the more he realized how deep the corruption ran. It wasn't just one bad officer. It was a system that had allowed it to happen, a system that had turned a blind eye to the wrongdoings of its own members. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the investigation came to an end. The last of the officers involved in the scheme were arrested, and the case was closed. The corrupt network had been dismantled, and the officers who had participated in the framing of innocent people were held accountable. But the damage had already been done. James would never forget what had happened to him. He was free now, but the process of healing would take time. There were still days when the memories of his wrongful arrest would flood back, when he would wonder if he would ever feel truly safe again. But there were also days when he could see a glimmer of hope. The truth had come out, and justice had been served, at least for now. James knew that he would never be the same person he had been before the arrest. But he had also learned something important, that he had the strength to overcome even the darkest of circumstances. He could move forward, rebuild his life, and take the lessons from this experience with him. He had been given a second chance, and he wasn't going to waste it. As the years passed, James found peace in knowing that he had done what he could to make sure that no one else would suffer like he had. He and Sarah rebuilt their lives, and though they were forever changed by the events that had transpired, they had each other. And that, James realized, was enough.